The clock above the counter showed 9:42 p.m. when Laura Whitfield wiped down the last table. The diner was quiet now, the air thick with the smell of coffee and fried onions. She stacked the chairs, turned off the neon open sign and checked the register twice before locking it shut. It was a routine she had followed every night for years. Nothing about this one seemed different. Outside, the cold air carried the faint hum of passing cars on the highway. A light snow had started to fall, the kind that barely touched the ground before melting. Laura pulled her coat tighter, her breath forming small clouds as she walked toward her car parked at the far end of the lot. She waved to her co-worker, Janet Miller, who was finishing up inside. Janet waved back, shouting something about seeing her tomorrow. Laura smiled faintly. That smile would be the last anyone saw of her. The headlights cut through the dim street as she started her old blue Chevrolet. The radio came on mid-song, a soft country tune, as she pulled out onto the main road leading toward her small rented home on the edge of Glenwood Springs. It was an easy 15-minute drive, familiar and lonely. At 9:57 p.m., she passed the last gas station before the canyon road. The clerk inside would later remember the car, the flash of its headlights, and the driver who never looked his way. Minutes later, the car turned onto a narrow rural route, bordered by thick pine and open land. The snow was steady now, brushing the windshield like sand. The wipers moved rhythmically, keeping her view clear as she adjusted the heater dial. No one knows exactly what happened after that. At 10:21 p.m., a rancher driving home saw the same blue Chevrolet pulled slightly to the side of the road with its lights still on. He assumed it was a stalled vehicle and drove past, planning to call it in when he reached home. By the time deputies arrived nearly 30 minutes later, Laura Whitfield was gone. The car engine was still running. The driver's side door hung half open, the interior light glowing faintly against the snow. Laura's purse sat on the passenger seat, untouched, with her wallet and cash still inside. Her coat was missing. The ground nearby showed faint footprints leading toward the woods, then stopping abruptly where the snow had thickened. Deputy Mark Yates noted how quiet the scene felt. There were no tire tracks other than Laura's, no sign of struggle, no skid marks. The car keys remained in the ignition. He radioed the station. Possible missing person. Vehicle found occupied, engine running, no driver on site. Within an hour, a small team began to search the wooded area with flashlights. Their beams cut across the trees, bouncing off ice-crusted branches. They found nothing. By midnight, the temperature had dropped sharply. The sheriff ordered the search paused until dawn. The car was towed and impounded for examination. Officers dusted the door handle, steering wheel and gear shift for prints. None that were not Laura's were found. At 6 a.m., the search resumed. Volunteers joined the deputies, moving in tight lines along the roadside, calling her name. The wind drowned most of their voices. A pair of gloves was discovered 50 yards from the road, but they were old, weathered, likely discarded long before. By mid-morning, news of the disappearance had spread across Glenwood Springs. The local radio station broadcasted her description. 28 years old, brown hair, 5 feet 5 inches tall, last seen wearing a navy coat and gray scarf. The sheriff's department received 3 calls from people claiming to have seen someone walking near the river the night before, but none could confirm it was her. Investigators returned to the diner later that day. Janet Miller confirmed that Laura had seemed normal, maybe a little tired. The register balanced perfectly. Nothing unusual, no arguments, no strange customers that she remembered. Detective Raymond Holt arrived from the county office that afternoon to take charge of the case. He examined Laura's time card, checked her route home, and ordered immediate sweeps of all nearby properties. He noticed the small detail that stuck with him. The car's clock had stopped at 10:22 p.m., likely when the battery died hours after she vanished. As the day faded, the search widened. A helicopter scanned the riverbanks. Dogs followed the scent from the car to the edge of the woods, then lost it near the frozen waterline. That evening, the sheriff stood before local reporters and delivered the first official statement. "We are treating this as a missing person case. At this point, all possibilities remain open." The following night, the same rancher who had seen the car returned to the site. He told deputies he could not sleep, that something about that scene had stayed with him. He pointed out a faint trail near the river bend, almost hidden beneath the snow. Deputies followed it, marking each step until the trail veered sharply downhill toward a cluster of trees. At the end of that path, near a patch of broken brush, they found a single object lying half buried in ice. A silver locket. The engraving was faint, the letters worn from time but still visible, RC. The snow began to fall harder as the officers sealed off the area. The discovery changed the tone of the entire search. This was no longer a simple disappearance. Something else had happened in those woods. The investigation had only begun, but the silence around Laura Whitfield's last drive that night would soon stretch for decades. The locket was the first clue, and for 42 years, it would be the only one. Laura Whitfield was born in 1952 in the small town of Rifle, Colorado. She was the eldest of 2 daughters, known for her steady temperament and quiet strength. People described her as dependable, the kind of person who showed up early, worked hard, and rarely complained. After her father died in a mining accident when she was a teenager, Laura took part-time jobs to help her mother keep their home. That sense of responsibility followed her into adulthood. At 21, she married a local miner named Paul Whitfield. They lived in a modest house at the edge of town and dreamed of starting a family. But tragedy returned too soon. In 1978, just 6 years after their wedding, Paul was killed in a mine collapse near Glenwood Springs. Laura never remarried. She moved to a smaller home and began working double shifts at Marlene's Diner, a familiar landmark along Highway 82. Those who knew her said she carried grief quietly. She kept to herself, polite but distant. She volunteered once a week at the library and spent most evenings at home with her sister, Martha, or reading on her porch. She did not drink or go out late, and her life revolved around simple routines. To many in Glenwood Springs, she seemed like a woman slowly rebuilding after loss. Detectives later learned that Laura's finances were stable. She had recently paid off her car and saved a modest amount in her bank account. She had no history of conflict, no known enemies, and no reason to vanish. Nothing in her life suggested danger. That made her disappearance even harder to understand. Her co-workers remembered the same details again and again. She finished her shift at 9:40 p.m., counted the register, and left as usual. She smiled, said goodnight, and drove away. There was no distress, no sign of fear. Everything pointed to a normal end to an ordinary day. Investigators interviewed her sister, Martha, who broke down when she described the night Laura failed to come home. Martha said she called the diner, then the sheriff's office, then hospitals. She drove the route herself at dawn, scanning the roadside for any sign of her sister's car. By the time deputies found the vehicle hours later, Martha was already standing behind the police tape, refusing to believe what she saw. The following week, the community held a candlelight vigil in front of the diner. The crowd was small but silent. A photograph of Laura, smiling faintly behind the counter, sat beneath a single burning candle. Her co-workers closed the diner for 2 days out of respect. In the first few days after her disappearance, detectives tried to piece together her final movements. No one could explain why she might have stopped her car on that rural road. There were no calls from her that night, no mechanical issues with the vehicle, and no signs of anyone following her. The town began to whisper. Some thought she had accepted a ride from a stranger. Others believed she might have known the person who approached her. Detectives avoided speculation. They needed facts, not theories. All they had was the car, the footprints, and that silver locket marked with the letters RC to them. It was not just a clue. It was the only thread connecting Laura's peaceful life to the violence that had taken her away. The search began before sunrise. The air was brittle, the ground frozen under a thin layer of snow. Deputies spread out along the road where Laura Whitfield's car had been found, their flashlights slicing through the morning fog. Detective Raymond Holt walked the perimeter. It had been more than 10 hours since anyone had last seen her. Every detail. The open driver's door, the keys still in the ignition, the purse untouched on the seat. Everything pointed to a sudden interruption, something that had stopped Laura before she could even close the door. The footprints leading into the woods were shallow, faint and quickly fading as the temperature climbed. They appeared to belong to a single person, most likely Laura herself. Search dogs were brought in by mid-morning. They followed the scent for several hundred yards before losing it near the edge of the Colorado River. Deputies marked the spot with yellow tape and red stakes. From there, the terrain dropped sharply toward the water. a rough mix of rocks, brush, and ice. It was dangerous ground, difficult even for trained teams to navigate. The sheriff's department expanded the search area. Local volunteers joined, combing through the woods, ditches, and riverbanks. Helicopters circled overhead, scanning the snow for any sign of clothing or movement. Every hour that passed felt heavier. At 11:42 a.m., one of the volunteers, a retired forest ranger named Frank Dillard, radioed in from half a mile downstream. He had found something partially buried near a fallen log, a piece of dark fabric sticking out from under the brush. Deputies converged on the site within minutes. They moved slowly, methodically, clearing away branches and snow. Beneath it lay a woman's body, curled slightly, her arms positioned close to her chest. Her clothing matched the description from the missing persons report: navy coat, grey scarf, black slacks. The scarf had come loose, tangled around her sleeve. Detective Holt stood beside the coroner as they examined the scene. There were visible bruises on the head and jawline, and a small cut near the temple. The snow had preserved much of the evidence, but the cold had also masked crucial details. There were no defensive wounds visible at first glance. It was clear she had been placed there deliberately. The body was found less than half a mile from where the car had been discovered. The autopsy later confirmed cause of death as blunt force trauma to the skull. No sign of sexual assault, no robbery, no personal motive visible. The killer had left her purse untouched, her jewelry still on, except for one missing item, the silver locket later found during the second search. Forensic technicians worked carefully to collect samples, fibers from the coat, traces of dirt under the nails, a single strand of hair caught in the scarf's threads. All of it was sealed, labeled, and sent to the state lab in Denver. In 1980, forensic testing was limited. DNA profiling did not yet exist, and fingerprint analysis relied on clear, visible prints. There were none. The discovery sent shock through Glenwood Springs. News spread within hours. By evening, local television stations had already run the story. Woman found dead near Colorado River. Reporters stood outside the sheriff's office. Asking questions Holt could not yet answer. He reviewed the timeline again that night. Laura had left work at 9:42 p.m. Her car was found just before 10:30. The distance between the diner and the discovery site was less than 10 miles. That left less than an hour unaccounted for. Whoever took her had acted fast, confident, and silent. The location of the body raised another question. The riverbank was not far from a small service road, used mostly by utility trucks and hunters. The killer had likely known the area well. There were no visible drag marks, suggesting she had been carried there or driven closer before being placed in the brush. Investigators searched for tire tracks but found none. The snow had covered everything. At the sheriff's department, detectives built a timeline board. Photographs of the car, the road, and the recovery site were pinned side by side. The locket found near the body was placed in an evidence bag, marked Key Item NASA 14. The engraving, RC, was photographed, magnified, and analyzed for any trace of DNA or fingerprints. None were found. Detective Holt made a note in his report that night. Locket appears out of place. Not worn by victim. Could belong to perpetrator or unknown third party. He could not have known then that this small object would become the center of the case, a silent witness to everything that had happened. The following day, the coroner released the official statement confirming Laura Whitfield's identity. Cause of death, blunt force trauma. Manner of death, homicide. The town held its breath. What began as a disappearance had now turned into a murder investigation. Detectives gathered the evidence, filed their reports, and prepared to question everyone who had seen Laura alive that night. Somewhere in that circle, among co-workers, friends, or strangers, was the person who had followed her into the cold. The locket remained on Holt's desk under a small evidence tag. Its engraved letters gleamed faintly under the fluorescent light. RC, he did not yet know who those initials belonged to. But he was certain of one thing. Whoever had dropped that locket had taken a life, and that person was still out there. Detective Raymond Holt began the formal investigation the morning after the discovery. The sheriff's office was crowded with reporters, volunteers, and townspeople demanding answers. The case had moved fast, less than 48 hours from disappearance to homicide. Now came the hard part, finding out who did it. Holt started with the obvious leads. He and Detective Ellen Price, his partner on the case, reviewed Laura Whitfield's final hours again and again. They drove her route from the diner to the point where her car was found. The stretch of road was quiet even during the day. No houses nearby, only open land and trees. There were no security cameras in 1980, no phones to trace, and no witnesses who had seen her stop. The first person interviewed was Dale Benson, a mechanic in his early 30s who had been seen talking to Laura at the diner a week before her death. He admitted he liked her, said they had coffee once but denied any involvement. His alibi checked out. He had been at a bar in Aspen that night with several witnesses confirming it. Next, detectives spoke with Janet Miller, Laura's co-worker. She repeated her statement. Laura had been cheerful, finishing her shift as usual. No phone calls, no strange customers. Holt noted Janet's nervousness, but found no inconsistencies in her story. By the third day, the investigation shifted to evidence. Forensic technicians examined Laura's car in detail. The driver's seat position matched her height. There were no signs of forced entry. The passenger seat, however, showed slight disturbance, as if someone had sat there briefly. Fibers were collected but produced no match in the state database. The locket remained the most intriguing clue. The initials RC offered a narrow path, but none of Laura's known friends or acquaintances matched those letters. Holt cross-referenced every male resident within 30 miles whose first or last name began with R or C. The list reached over 100 names. Each one was methodically checked and eliminated. Days turned into weeks. The sheriff's office released public appeals, asking anyone who had driven along County Road 12 on the night of December 14th to come forward. A few calls came in, but none added new information. The only person who reported seeing her car that night remained the rancher who first called it in. His statement was consistent. Lights on, engine running, no one in sight. Detective Price managed the growing case files while Holt focused on the forensics. He requested expanded testing on the clothing for any trace evidence, paint flakes, soil, or fibers. The state lab returned results that added little. No foreign fibers, no blood other than the victim's. Holt began to suspect the killer had planned carefully. The scene felt clean, too clean. Whoever had attacked Laura knew the area and took her at a moment when she was completely alone. He ordered background checks on all regular customers of the diner. Most were locals, truck drivers, and traveling salesmen who passed through weekly. One name stood out briefly: a traveling auto parts supplier named Richard Cole, who had visited the diner several times in November. He was polite, friendly, and left generous tips. No one reported anything unusual about him. Holt made a note but moved on. There was no reason yet to connect him to the murder. Weeks later, the first snowfall of January covered the roadside once again. Patrols still passed the spot where her car had been found, but no new evidence emerged. By February, the town's fear had settled into silence. The initial energy of the search faded. The diner reopened, though business was slower. People still spoke Laura's name, but mostly in quiet tones. For Detective Holt, the case became an obsession. Every report circled back to the same mystery. No witnesses, no physical evidence, no motive. The investigation had reached its first wall. The locket sat sealed in its evidence bag, unsolved, unexplained, and somewhere in Colorado, the person whose initials it carried remained untouched by suspicion. By the end of February, snow blanketed the town like a burial shroud. The streets of Renfield grew quieter with each passing week, as if the cold itself had frozen people's voices. The once bustling diner now closed before dark. Its flickering neon sign no longer a beacon for travelers, but a reminder of what had been lost. Inside the sheriff's office, the murder case sat in a thick brown folder on Detective Raymond Holt's desk. Each morning he opened it, hoping something new might surface. Each night he closed it again, heavier in his hands. The town had begun to whisper. Some said the killer was a drifter, long gone by now. Others were certain it was someone local, someone who smiled, nodded, and still walked freely among them. Fear crept into ordinary life. Doors that had once stayed unlocked were now bolted before sunset. Women no longer walked alone after dark. Even the church pews felt emptier. Father McKinnon, who had baptized Laura as a baby, spoke gently of unanswered sins and the weight of justice yet to come. His sermons drew tears and silence, but no peace. At the diner, Janet Miller continued to work. Though her hands trembled whenever a stranger entered, she'd begun to close the register early, locking the doors long before closing time. She missed Laura terribly. Her laugh, her warmth, the way she used to hum while washing cups. Now every sound seemed louder in her absence. The scrape of chairs, the ticking of the clock, the hollow quiet between customers. Sometimes late at night, Janet would catch sight of Laura's car parked behind the impound lot, covered in frost. It felt wrong that it sat there, mute evidence of something unspeakable, while life pretended to move on. Detective Holt spent those same nights driving the back roads, retracing the route again and again. His partner, Ellen Price, worried he was slipping into obsession. "You can't chase ghosts, Ray," she told him one night over coffee. "If the evidence isn't there, it isn't there." But Holt couldn't let it go. "Evidence doesn't disappear," he said quietly. "Someone took it with them." He wasn't the only one haunted. Across town, Laura's mother, Martha Whitfield, had begun to fade. Her husband had died years before, and Laura had been her only child. Now she sat by the window of her small house each evening, watching the snow fall, waiting for a knock that would never come. People visited less and less. They didn't know what to say anymore. Martha kept Laura's room exactly as it had been, the bed neatly made, the framed photograph of her daughter on the nightstand, smiling in her diner uniform. On the dresser, she'd placed a small candle that she lit every night. She prayed the flame would draw her daughter's spirit home. But one night in March, something strange happened. The sheriff's office received a call from a trucker named Earl McVeigh, who had been driving along County Road 12 near midnight. He reported seeing a woman standing on the shoulder, wearing a light dress despite the cold. When he slowed down, she turned toward him, then vanished into the darkness. Holt drove out immediately. Snow still covered the road, but there were fresh footprints, small, bare, and leading nowhere. They ended halfway down the slope, as if whoever had made them had simply disappeared. He stood there for a long time, his breath hanging in the frozen air. Logic told him the snow had drifted, that the prints were half illusions. But a part of him, the part that had begun to dream of Laura's face every night, wondered if the dead really could linger where justice had failed. Back in town, word of the apparition spread fast. Some dismissed it as gossip, others swore they believed it. Martha Whitfield heard the story too, and for the first time in weeks she smiled faintly. "She's not gone," she whispered to herself. "She's waiting." That night, Holt wrote his report and closed it without signing. He didn't believe in ghosts, not really, but he did believe in messages, and maybe this one, however it came, meant something was about to change. The call came just after dawn. Detective Raymond Holt was pouring his first cup of coffee when the dispatcher's voice came over the line. Calm but tense. A hunter had found something in the woods east of County Road 12. Holt was already out the door before the message finished. Snow still covered the ground, but it had begun to melt, leaving a thin layer of mud and ice. The forest smelled of wet pine and decay. Deputies marked a narrow trail that led to a shallow ravine. There, half buried under fallen branches, lay a woman's shoe. It was scuffed, but unmistakably the same kind that Laura Whitfield had been wearing the night she vanished. Nearby, the team found a torn piece of fabric tangled around a branch, pale blue, faded from the weather. Holt placed it carefully into an evidence bag, his gloves trembling slightly. For months the investigation had gone cold. Now the forest was finally giving up its secrets. The search widened. Officers moved methodically, their breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Forensics units combed through the site, uncovering traces of something that had once been human. Fragments of bone, strands of hair, small pieces of jewelry too corroded to shine. When the medical examiner arrived, she crouched beside the remains, her voice low and certain. Female, likely late 20s. Holt stood silent. He did not need confirmation. He already knew. Back in town, word spread quickly. The diner closed early, and people gathered in hushed clusters outside the sheriff's office. No one said Laura's name out loud, but every face showed the same quiet dread. Martha Whitfield was called in later that evening. Holt met her in his office, his expression heavy with something between duty and sorrow. He told her what they had found, not all the details, just enough. She listened without crying. "I always knew she was out there," she said softly. "I just did not know where." The forensic team worked through the night. DNA confirmation would take weeks, but the personal effects told their own story. Inside the shallow grave, wrapped in a thin plastic covering, they found Laura's gold necklace, the one she never took off. Holt sat at his desk, reviewing the photographs. Something about the way the scene was arranged bothered him. The body had not been dumped carelessly. The covering, the placement of the branches, it looked deliberate, almost ritualistic. He thought of the tire tracks found months earlier, leading away from the dirt road. They had belonged to an older pickup, one that had never been identified. The next morning he reopened every report, every witness statement. That was when he saw it, a small note in the margin of an early interview. A local mechanic, Frank Dillard, had once mentioned fixing an old Ford truck around the same time Laura disappeared. It belonged to a man who lived out near the ridge, Harlan Grover, a logger who often worked nights alone. Grover had never been questioned beyond a routine check. He had no record, no reason for suspicion, but Holt remembered his name now, written faintly in pencil. He drove out that same afternoon. Grover's property sat miles from town, surrounded by trees and silence. The man was outside splitting wood when Holt arrived. His eyes were sharp, his movements calm, too calm. When Holt mentioned Laura Whitfield, Grover's axe paused mid-swing, just for a moment. Then he nodded and said he remembered her from the diner. Good girl. Always polite. The conversation was brief, ordinary on the surface. But when Holt turned to leave, he noticed something leaning against the barn wall, a rusted Ford pickup half covered by a tarp. Back at the station, Holt ordered a warrant. The team returned that night. Beneath the tarp, they found what he had feared, the same make and tire pattern that matched the evidence from Laura's disappearance. Inside the truck bed, buried beneath old ropes and tools, they discovered traces of blood. The preliminary test came back positive. The next morning, as the sun rose over Glenwood Springs, the sheriff's office issued a statement. A suspect has been identified in connection with the disappearance and death of Laura Whitfield. But Holt did not feel relief. Something in Grover's expression, the calmness, the certainty, had unsettled him. He had seen guilt before. This felt different. As he looked over the forest once more, Holt realized this might not be the end of the case. It might only be the beginning of something darker. The interrogation room was small, windowless and silent, except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Harlan Grover sat across from Detective Raymond Holt, his hands resting flat on the metal table. His expression was 52, calm, broad-shouldered for a man accused with weathered skin and hands rough from years of labor. His eyes were pale gray, almost colorless. They gave nothing away. On the table between them lay the evidence photos, the abandoned car, the torn fabric, the gold necklace, the tire impressions. Each piece lined up like a trail of ghosts pointing toward the man in front of him. Holt began with the simplest question. When was the last time you saw Laura Whitfield? Grover leaned back in his chair, thinking carefully before he spoke. At the diner, maybe 2 or 3 days before she went missing. She brought me coffee, same as always. His voice was steady, his tone almost polite. Holt slid a photograph across the table, the rusted Ford pickup found under Grover's tarp. This vehicle matches the tire marks from the crime scene. You own it. Can you explain that? Grover glanced down, then back up, unflinching. That old truck? I have had it for years. Anyone could have borrowed it. I leave the keys in it sometimes. The whole town knows that. Holt did not respond. He simply watched. Silence, he had learned, could be louder than accusation. Minutes passed before Grover shifted in his seat. You really think I killed that girl? He asked, his voice low but steady. Holt leaned forward slightly. I think your truck was at the scene. I think your story about the night she disappeared has changed 3 times. And I think you know something you have not told anyone. For the first time, Grover looked uneasy. His fingers tapped against the metal surface, a slow, deliberate rhythm. You do not know what you are talking about, he said finally. You have no proof. Holt opened a folder and took out a single sheet. The preliminary forensic report. We found traces of blood in your truck bed, he said evenly. DNA testing confirms it matches Laura Whitfield. Grover's tapping stopped. He stared at the paper, his expression unreadable. Then he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. You are making a mistake, Holt waited. Grover's eyes flicked toward the mirror on the wall, knowing others were watching. "You think you found everything, but you do not understand what really happened," he said. Holt did not take the bait. He kept his tone measured. "Then explain it to me." Grover's mouth tightened. For a long time he said nothing. The silence pressed heavy between them until Holt began gathering his files. Only then did Grover speak again. "She came to my cabin that night," he said suddenly. "She wanted help. She was scared." Holt froze. "Scared of what?" Grover looked up, his gaze sharp. "Of someone following her. She said a man had been watching her after work. She did not tell me who. She just wanted a ride home." Holt studied him carefully. "You are saying you gave her a ride?" Grover nodded. "I dropped her near the old mill road. She said she would be fine from there. That is the last time I saw her." The confession was partial, deliberate, just enough to muddy the truth. Holt had heard many like it before. He knew what it meant. Grover was trying to control the story. The interview ended after 3 hours. Grover maintained his calm, even as officers escorted him back to holding. Outside the room, Holt met with the district attorney. The evidence was strong but circumstantial. The DNA linked to Laura's blood placed her in Grover's truck, but not necessarily in his hands. They needed more. That night, Holt returned to the evidence room. He stared at the photographs again, the torn fabric, the shoe, the way the scene had been arranged. Something about Grover's account did not fit. If Laura had been scared, why had she left her purse and car behind? Why walk into the dark? The next morning, Holt went through Laura's case file again. Hidden among the reports was a name that had been almost forgotten, a former co-worker who had left town shortly after the disappearance. The report said he had been questioned once and cleared. But the timing of his departure, just weeks after Laura vanished, seemed too convenient now. Holt closed the folder and made a decision. Before charging Harlan Grover, he would follow this lead quietly off the record, because something about Grover's calmness did not feel like guilt. It felt like fear. The DNA report arrived on a grey Monday morning. Detective Raymond Holt had been expecting confirmation, something solid to secure the case against Harlan Grover. Instead, what landed on his desk was a quiet explosion. The report began with a single line that changed everything. Partial secondary DNA profile recovered from blood sample. Does not match suspect Harlan Grover. Holt read it twice, then a third time. The words did not change. The blood in Grover's truck belonged to Laura Whitfield. That much was certain. But mixed with it was another DNA trace. Male, unknown, not Grover. He sat back, staring at the ceiling. Weeks of investigation had built a case around one man. A man who, until that morning, looked guilty beyond question. Now the evidence told a different story. By noon, the forensic lab called to clarify the results. The secondary DNA was not just a trace. It was significant enough to suggest direct physical contact. Someone else had been close to Laura at the time she was injured. Holt hung up the phone slowly. His instincts had been right. He reopened the files again, this time focusing on the forgotten co-worker, Dean Rourke, 31 years old in 1980. He had worked the night shift at the same diner as Laura, left town weeks after her disappearance, and had never returned. His record showed no major crimes, but there were small incidents, bar fights, a restraining order filed in 1978 by a woman in Denver. It was enough to draw attention now. Holt called the Bureau's regional office. Within hours, they began searching for any record of Dean Rourke. It did not take long to find him. He was living under a different name in New Mexico, working as a mechanic. Holt requested a new DNA sample through the database. 2 days later, the results arrived, a perfect match to the unknown male DNA found with Laura's blood. Everything shifted at once. The press did not know yet, and Holt wanted to keep it that way. Grover was still in custody, but now as a person of interest, not a confirmed killer. The sheriff called it a developing situation. Holt called it what it was a mistake narrowly avoided. The next step was clear. A warrant for Dean Rourke's arrest was issued quietly. When agents approached his workshop in Santa Fe, Rourke did not resist. He seemed resigned, almost detached, as if the past had finally caught up and he had known it would. In the interrogation room, Holt sat across from him. The resemblance to his old personnel photo was faint, grayer hair, sunburned skin, hollow eyes. But the coldness was the same. "You worked with Laura Whitfield," Holt said. "You left town after she disappeared." Rourke nodded. "Yes. Why?" "I needed to leave," Rourke replied. "Things got complicated." Holt opened a file laying out the evidence. DNA match statements timeline. "Your DNA was found with her blood. You were there when she died." Rourke's eyes flickered. "You do not understand," he said softly. "It was not supposed to happen like that." Holt leaned forward. "Then tell me what happened." Rourke hesitated. Then, almost in a whisper, he began to speak. "She was scared. She told me someone had been following her. I offered to drive her home. But when we got to that dirt road, she said she wanted to meet the person, to end it. She got out, I waited. Then there was shouting. When I ran toward her, she was on the ground. There was blood. I panicked. I tried to help, but she was already gone." Holt watched him closely. "Who was she meeting?" Rourke shook his head. "I never saw him. Just headlights, then nothing." The confession was fragmented, half truth, half defense. But one thing was clear. Rourke had been there that night. Later that evening, Holt returned to the evidence board. He moved Rourke's photo next to Grover's. 2 men, 1 victim, 1 night, their paths crossing in silence. The forensic twist had blown open what once seemed simple. The district attorney ordered further testing on every item recovered from the burial site. Beneath layers of soil and time, another fragment of evidence surfaced. A fingerprint on the plastic sheet that had wrapped Laura's body. It did not match Rourke. It did not match Grover. It belonged to someone else entirely. Holt stood in the lab, staring at the print record under the fluorescent light. The technician's voice was hushed but firm. "Detective, this belongs to a former deputy. A man who worked here in Glenwood Springs in 1980. For a long moment, Holt said nothing. A chill ran through him, deeper than any he had felt before. This case, he realized, had not just been mishandled. It had been protected. Detective Raymond Holt stared at the fingerprint record for a long time. The name printed below it was one he knew well. Deputy Charles Renner. Renner had served under the county sheriff in 1980 during the initial investigation into Laura Whitfield's disappearance. He had retired years ago quietly after a disciplinary review that never became public. At the time, Holt had barely noticed the name buried in the old reports. Now it felt like the missing piece that had been hiding in plain sight. The print was found on the plastic sheeting that had wrapped Laura's remains, a controlled material, the kind used only by law enforcement for evidence protection or transport. There was no legitimate reason it should have been near the lab to double-check before the analyst confirmed the result twice. There was no mistake. By afternoon, Holt drove out to Renner's home, a weathered cabin on the outskirts of Glenwood Springs. The man was in his late 70s now, his face drawn, his movements slow. He greeted Holt with a polite smile that did not reach his eyes. "You still working that old Whitfield case?" Renner asked, his voice gravely amused. Holt nodded. "We found new evidence." Renner's expression did not change. "That so?" Inside, the house smelled of dust and old wood. Faded photos lined the mantel. Renner in uniform, fishing with friends, standing beside patrol cars that looked older than memory. Holt noticed a photograph of the 1980 Sheriff's Department staff. Renner stood in the middle, hand resting on another man's shoulder, Sheriff Ed Connors, his superior at the time. Holt's pulse slowed. Connors had died in 1999, never questioned about the case again. He turned back to Renner. "You were assigned to the Whitfield investigation. You handled the car scene. You processed the evidence." Renner's smile faded. "That was 45 years ago, Detective. You think I remember every case I worked?" Holt placed a photograph of the plastic sheet on the table between them. "Your fingerprint was found on this. It was wrapped around Laura's body." For the first time, Renner looked away. His jaw tightened. The silence stretched until the only sound was the ticking of a clock in the corner. "You should leave this alone," Renner said quietly. "That case destroyed enough people already." Holt leaned forward. "Who were you protecting?" Renner did not answer. He stood slowly, his body trembling slightly with age. "You think justice is clean, Detective," he said. "It never is. Back then, things were handled differently." "Handled," Holt repeated. "You mean covered up?" Renner turned toward the window. Laura was seeing someone. A man she should not have been with. Someone important. When she went missing, there was pressure. Calls from people above the sheriff. We were told to close it quietly. Holt's voice stayed low. Who was the man? Renner's shoulders sagged. Sheriff Connors. She worked at the diner he always went to. They were involved. When she tried to end it, he lost control. The words hung in the air like cold smoke. Holt felt the weight of them settle across decades of silence. Renner continued, his voice breaking. He called me that night. Told me she was dead. Said it was an accident. I went to help. We buried her in the woods, thought it would never come back. Holt asked. And Harlan Grover? Dean Rourke? Convenient suspects, Renner said. They kept the story alive but pointed the blame away. I wanted to come forward once Connors died, but I was afraid. I still am. He sank back into his chair, exhausted, defeated. Holt stood in silence. The truth was out, ugly, buried beneath years of corruption and fear. But the confession alone would not be enough. They needed physical proof, records, anything tying Connors to Laura. Back at the station, Holt ordered a full archival search. It took 2 days to locate the old sheriff's storage files. Inside, among yellowed reports and water-damaged evidence logs, they found a key piece, a missing page from the 1980 incident report. It detailed an unrecorded visit by Sheriff Connors to the diner the night Laura disappeared. Time-stamped 9:43 p.m., less than an hour before her car was found. The document had been signed by Deputy Charles Renner. That signature, preserved in fading blue ink, completed the chain. When the report went public weeks later, the community's reaction was stunned silence. Glenwood Springs had lived for decades believing Laura Whitfield had vanished without reason. Now they learned that the truth had been hidden by the very men sworn to protect them. For the first time in 45 years, her name was officially cleared of rumor and speculation. But for Holt, it was not closure. Not yet. Renner's confession had opened one last door, the question of who else had known, and how many had stayed silent. The truth, he realized, was not buried with Laura Whitfield. It was buried inside the institution that had failed her, and now someone would have to answer for it. The morning the arrest was made, the air in Glenwood Springs felt heavy, the kind of silence that settles before a storm. Reporters had already gathered outside the courthouse by sunrise, their cameras trained on the entrance. For the first time in 45 years, the Whitfield case was no longer a mystery whispered in back rooms. It was a headline. Detective Raymond Holt arrived early, the case file tucked under his arm. Inside were the final pieces, the forensic records, the recovered report, and the recorded confession from former Deputy Charles Renner. The district attorney had reviewed everything overnight and made the call. An arrest warrant would be issued for Renner on charges of accessory to murder, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice. Renner did not resist when they came for him. He stood on his porch, coat buttoned neatly as if expecting them. When Holt stepped forward to read the charges, Renner nodded once, eyes distant. I knew it would end like this, he said quietly. Holt did not reply. There was no satisfaction in this moment, only the grim duty of closing a wound that had festered for decades. At the station, Renner gave one last statement. He confirmed every detail, that Sheriff Ed Connors had killed Laura Whitfield in a confrontation that turned violent, that Renner had helped conceal the body, and that the department had silently buried the truth to protect its leader. The sheriff said no one would believe her, Renner said. He was right. No one ever did. Outside, news of the confession spread quickly. For many in Glenwood Springs, it shattered something deeper than faith in their police. It broke their belief in the stories they had grown up with. At the old diner where Laura had once worked, a handwritten sign appeared on the door. For Laura, gone but not forgotten. Someone left a single yellow rose beneath it. Later that week, Holt met with Martha Whitfield at her home. She was older now, frail, her hands trembling as she held the report. Holt told her the truth plainly, without dramatics. She listened quietly, her eyes filling but never breaking. So it was them, she said softly. All this time? Yes, Holt answered. The sheriff. And Renner helped him, she nodded slowly. I always said the wrong men paid the price. Holt placed a sealed envelope on the table, a certified copy of the official case closure report, stamped solved. Your daughter's name will be cleared, he said. The town will know what really happened. Martha smiled faintly. That is all I ever wanted. Renner's trial began 3 months later. Because of his age and deteriorating health, the proceedings were brief. He pleaded guilty to all charges and was sentenced to 15 years, though no one expected him to serve more than a few. In court he spoke only once. I have carried her ghost with me every day, he said. Now I can finally stop running. For Holt, the case marked both an ending and a beginning. The state launched an internal review of all investigations, conducted under Sheriff Connor's administration. Files long forgotten were reopened, and questions once buried in silence were asked again. In Glenwood Springs, the community gathered on a cold autumn afternoon for a small memorial at the edge of the woods where Laura had been found. Her name was carved into a simple stone plaque beside a creek. No speeches, no music, just quiet recognition that truth, though delayed, had finally found its way home. Holt stood at the back, hands in his coat pockets, watching as townspeople placed flowers near the memorial. Some of them had been children when Laura vanished. Others were new to the town, hearing her story for the first time. He thought of how easily history could be rewritten, how many lives could be shaped by silence. Justice, he realized, was not always about punishment. Sometimes it was about restoring truth to the places where lies had taken root. As the crowd began to leave, Holt lingered by the creek. The wind moved through the trees softly, carrying the scent of pine and earth. In that stillness he imagined Laura, a young woman driving home after a long shift, unaware that her name would one day echo through decades of waiting. He looked down at the plaque one last time. The inscription read Laura Whitfield, 1952-1980. Her silence is no longer ours to keep. Holt turned away, walking back toward his car. Behind him, the forest stood quiet again, not as a place of secrets, but of remembrance. The case was closed. But for Glenwood Springs, the truth would never fade. The plaque had weathered with time. Moss had crept along the edges, and the engraved letters were softer now, but still clear enough to read, Laura Whitfield. Her silence is no longer ours to keep. Every spring, someone left a single yellow rose beside it. No one ever saw who. In 2025, Glenwood Springs looked nothing like the quiet town it once was. The old diner was gone, replaced by a gas station and a row of chain stores. Yet the story of Laura Whitfield still lingered, in school lessons, in whispered memories, and in the faces of those who remembered what the town had allowed itself to forget. Detective Raymond Holt had retired years earlier. His badge was framed in his study, the Whitfield file sitting beside it, worn, yellowed, but complete. After the case closed, he stayed in Glenwood Springs for a while, though people said he rarely spoke of it. When he finally moved away, he left the file with the county archives, writing only one note on the cover: "Truth does not expire." It was there that a young journalist named Erin Cole found it decades later. She had grown up in Glenwood, her parents among those who once believed the rumors that Laura had simply run away. Erin had heard the story all her life: the waitress who vanished, the car on the roadside, the unanswered questions. But it was only when she read Holt's files that she understood how deep the deception had gone. She spent months researching, interviewing, and piecing together the forgotten parts of the story. In her documentary, The Whitfield Case, Buried by the Badge, she told the truth in full: the corruption, the silence, and the decades of false comfort that had shielded the guilty. The documentary aired nationwide. For the first time, Glenwood Springs was not a dot on a map, but the center of a long-delayed reckoning. People who had once dismissed the case wrote letters of apology to Martha Whitfield's surviving relatives. Former deputies came forward, admitting they had heard rumors but never questioned them. The local police department issued an official statement acknowledging the failure of accountability that cost an innocent woman her life. For many, the broadcast reopened old wounds. For others, it finally allowed them to heal. A small memorial gathering was held that winter at the same creek where Laura had been found. Among those attending was Erin, carrying a framed photograph, the only known image of Laura smiling behind the diner counter, her hair tied back, her eyes bright with the ordinary hope of someone who believed tomorrow would come. Beside her stood a man in his 60s, quiet and watchful. It was the son of Charles Renner, the deputy who had confessed before his death. He had asked to attend privately. When Erin offered him the rose she had brought, he took it without a word and placed it beside the plaque. "Your father told the truth," she said softly. He nodded. Too late for her. But maybe not too late for the rest of us. The wind picked up then, scattering pine needles across the ground. Somewhere in the distance a train passed, its faint whistle echoing through the valley, a sound that had always been part of Glenwood's rhythm. Later, Erin would write in her closing narration, "In the end, truth did not come with sirens or headlines. It came quietly, through the persistence of those who refused to forget." Laura Whitfield was not a symbol. She was a woman who trusted the wrong man, in the wrong town at the wrong time. Her story reminds us that justice is not measured by how fast it comes, but by whether it comes at all. When the documentary ended, viewers across the country sat in silence. There were no dramatics, no sweeping conclusions, only the quiet image of the plaque by the creek, half covered in snow, the yellow rose still visible beneath the white. Weeks later, Glenwood Springs announced that the wooded area near the memorial would be renamed Whitfield Preserve, a place for reflection, open to the public year-round. No one knew who attended the opening ceremony. There were no speeches, no cameras. Only a few locals stood together, listening to the sound of the creek as it moved steadily through the valley, the same sound Laura might have heard on her last night alive. For them, the story was no longer about tragedy. It was about endurance, the quiet persistence of truth in a place that once buried it. And for the first time in 45 years, Glenwood Springs could finally breathe again.